Have you ever seen someone absolutely drunk on a tiny sliver of power? The kind of person who makes life miserable for everyone unfortunate enough to be in their orbit? What happens, do you think, when those petty tyrants finally pick on a wrong person, someone they completely, utterly underestimated? Well, stick around because today I'm going to tell you about how my quiet suburban life, the one I'd chosen for peace and recovery, got turned completely upside down. And more importantly, how a couple of HOA enforcers learned a very hard, very personal lesson after they assaulted my wife, completely unaware of who I really was or what I was capable of. Where are you folks watching from today? Go ahead and let me know in the comments below. I always find it fascinating to see where these stories reach. And hey, if you've ever had your own crazy HOA story or dealt with some on a power trip, I'd genuinely love to hear about it. Misery loves company, right? But sometimes company can fight back. My name is John McMillan, but most who knew me from my former life just call me Mac. That former life was as a Navy SEAL. 20 years of it. The kind of work that leaves marks, both visible and invisible. When I retired, all I wanted was quiet. Peace. A place where the loudest thing I'd hear was birdsong, not gunfire. My wife, Sarah, had been through a rough patch with her health, a lingering illness that had drained her physically and emotionally. We found this house in Oak Haven, a sleepy little community that advertised itself as a sanctuary. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, the whole 9 yards. It seemed perfect, a place for Sarah to heal, to find joy in simple things again, like her garden. And for me, well, for me it was supposed to be a place to just be, to shed the skin of Mac the Seal and become John, the husband, the quiet neighbor. I was also carrying the fresh grief of losing a teammate, a brother, killed in our last deployment. That loss underscored my desire for a life where conflict was a distant memory. We moved in during the late spring. Sarah, bless her heart, immediately took to the small patch of earth in our backyard. She'd spend hours out there, coaxing life from the soil, her hands covered in dirt, a genuine smile finally returning to her face. Those moments, watching her find solace amongst the roses and herbs she was planting, were precious. I tried to settle into a new rhythm myself. Early morning runs, not for combat readiness anymore, but for clarity. Coffee on the porch, reading books instead of mission briefings. It was an adjustment, a significant one. The hypervigilance, the ingrained habit of assessing every person, every situation for potential threats. Those things didn't just switch off. I was working on it. I truly was. Our first brush with the Oak Haven Homeowners Association and its president, Arthur Cromwell, was minor, almost forgettable, yet it was a harbinger. A crisply folded note left on our door, citing a violation. Our trash receptacles were visible from the street for 2 hours longer than the prescribed window. Cromwell himself had apparently delivered it, as I saw his meticulously kept sedan cruising slowly away as I retrieved the mail. He was a man in his late 50s, always impeccably dressed, with a condescending smirk permanently etched on his face. He moved with an air of self-importance that was almost comical, given his domain was little more than a collection of suburban houses. We paid the small, irritating fine. Let go, Mac, I told myself. This is civilian life. Petty annoyances are part of the package. But the whispers started to reach us. Snatches of conversation from neighbors, hushed and resentful. Cromwell ran the HOA like a feudal lord. Rules were created on whims, fines were exorbitant, and his 2 enforcement officers, a pair of local louts named Riggs and Miller who seemed to relish their sliver of authority, were his bulldogs. They were burly, unpleasant men who swaggered rather than walked. I'd seen them around, usually together, looking for infractions with an almost gleeful intensity. My internal threat assessment filed them away. Unprofessional, prone to intimidation, likely compensating for insecurities. Manageable, but best avoided. I was here for peace, not to pick fights with neighborhood bullies. Then came the day that peace shattered. It was a beautiful Saturday morning. I was inside, going over some household finances, trying to make sense of a world that operated on spreadsheets instead of sit reps. Sarah was in her beloved garden, humming softly as she tended to a new bed of lavender she was particularly excited about. The sun was warm. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was idyllic. I heard raised voices. Not angry, initially more like insistent. I frowned, muted the television. Then Sarah's voice, a note of distress in it. But that doesn't make any sense. It's a new rule you just told me about. I was moving before I consciously decided to. Years of training, of reacting to a teammate in trouble, propelled me. I reached the back door just as the voices escalated. Riggs and Miller stood over Sarah. She was on her knees beside her lavender, looking up at them, a mixture of confusion and fear on her face. Riggs, the larger of the two, was jabbing a finger towards her plants. Miller stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, a smug look on his face. "Look, lady," Riggs was saying, his voice a gravelly sneer. Mr. Cromwell was very clear. No unapproved decorative stones around the flower beds. And those purple weeds? They gotta go. They're not on the Oakhaven approved planting list. Decorative stones? These are just a few rocks I found to edge the bed. And these are lavender plants. They aren't weeds. Sarah's voice trembled slightly, but she was trying to stand her ground. There was no mention of an approved planting list when we moved in. "Well, there is now," Miller chimed in, stepping forward. "And ignorance of the rules is no excuse. You're getting a citation. And these rocks? They're a tripping hazard." Before Sarah could respond, before I could even shout a warning, Riggs made a dismissive gesture with his foot, kicking out at the small pile of stones Sarah had carefully arranged. Several of them scattered, one striking a terracotta pot, cracking it. Then, as if to emphasize his point, he deliberately stepped on a cluster of her newly planted lavender, grinding his heel into the fragile stems. Sarah cried out, a small, wounded sound. "No, please." Riggs laughed. A short, ugly bark. "Just follow the rules, sweetheart, and there won't be any problems." Then Miller, perhaps emboldened by Riggs's casual cruelty or Sarah's distress, reached down and roughly shoved her shoulder. "Yeah, get this mess cleaned up." Sarah, caught off balance, stumbled and fell sideways onto the soft earth, her hands scraping against a concealed root. It wasn't a knockout blow, not a brutal beating, but it was an assault, a physical act of intimidation against a woman who posed no threat in her own garden. That was the precise moment the quiet, unassuming John McMillan receded, and Mac, the protector, the man who had faced down dangers far greater than these two thugs, came roaring to the surface. I was through the door in a flash, a cold, lethal calm settling over me. The world seemed to sharpen, colors grew more intense, sounds more distinct. My SEAL training had a name for it: combat focus. "Get your hands off my wife," I said. My voice was low, devoid of emotion, but it cut through the air like a blade. Riggs and Miller turned, surprised. They hadn't seen me. For a moment, they looked almost comical, like two schoolyard bullies caught by the principal. Riggs, recovering first, puffed out his chest. "And who are you?" "I'm her husband," I replied, moving to Sarah's side, helping her up. Her eyes were wide, a tear tracing a path through the dirt on her cheek. She was shaken, but more than that, she looked humiliated. A wave of fury, so intense it was almost clarifying, washed through me. I contained it. "For now. And you too are trespassing. You've assaulted my wife and damaged our property. I suggest you leave. Now." Miller snorted. "Or what, pal? You gonna call Cromwell on us? He sent us." "This isn't about Cromwell," I said, my gaze steady on Riggs, the more dominant of the pair. "This is about you. You put your hands on her." Riggs took a step towards me, trying for intimidation. He was taller, heavier. He probably thought I was just some soft suburbanite. "Yeah? And what are you going to do about it, old man?" Old man? I was 45, fit, and could still run circles around most men half my age. But I let the insult slide. Underestimation is a gift, one of my instructors used to say. Let them think you're weak. It makes them careless. "For now," I said, my voice still quiet, "I'm going to document your actions." "Sarah, are you all right?" I turned to her, my expression softening. She nodded, still shaken, clutching her scraped hand. "Go inside, honey. Call Dr. Evans, get that hand looked at, and then call the police. Report an assault. Her eyes widened slightly, then firmed with resolve. She understood. This wasn't just going to be swept under the rug. She nodded again and hurried inside. Riggs and Miller exchanged a glance. The mention of police seemed to momentarily deflate them, but Riggs quickly regained his bluster. Police? For what? A little push. She tripped. I saw what happened. I stated, my gaze unwavering. And I have a feeling that once the police hear about your pattern of harassment and Mr. Cromwell's enabling of it, they might be very interested, especially if other residents come forward. My mind was already working, processing, formulating the beginnings of strategy. This wasn't just about these two goons. This was about Cromwell, about the system he'd created. They hesitated. I could see the calculation in their eyes. They were bullies, not masterminds. Their authority was borrowed, fragile. You're making a big mistake, Riggs growled, but there was less conviction in his voice now. The mistake was made when you laid hands on my wife, I replied. Now, get off my property before I have you removed for trespassing as well. I took a small, almost imperceptible step forward. It wasn't aggressive, but it shifted my balance, made me a more stable platform. A warrior's stance. They might not have consciously recognized it, but their instincts probably screamed at them. Miller tugged on Riggs's arm. Come on, man. Let's just go. We'll tell Cromwell. Riggs shot me one last venomous look, then turned and stomped away, Miller scurrying after him. I watched them go, my posture relaxing only slightly when they were out of sight. The cold anger remained, a tightly coiled spring deep inside me. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. I went inside. Sarah was on the phone, her voice calm but firm as she spoke to the police dispatcher. I gently took her scraped hand, examining it. It wasn't deep, but it would bruise. The emotional wound, however, was far more significant. I saw the fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else, a reflection of my own resolve. They can't get away with this, Mac, she said, her voice quiet after she hung up. No, Sarah, I assured her, meeting her gaze. They won't in that moment. The decision was made. Not in anger, but with a cold, clear certainty. Arthur Cromwell and his petty reign of terror in Oakhaven were coming to an end. He just didn't know it yet. He had no idea who he'd just provoked. He saw a quiet new resident. He didn't see the years of training, the experience in dismantling threats far more complex and dangerous than a corrupt HOA president. This isn't Fallujah, I thought, echoing a sentiment I'd had before, but the principles of identifying the enemy, gathering intelligence, exploiting weaknesses, and neutralizing the threat remain the same. The police arrived, 2 young officers. They were polite, took Sarah's statement, photographed her hand and the damaged plants. I gave my witness account, keeping it factual, concise. I could tell they thought it was a minor neighborhood dispute, perhaps colored by the fact that HOAs often generated such calls. They promised to file a report and speak to Riggs and Miller, but I didn't expect much to come of it immediately through official channels alone. That was fine. Their report would be one piece of the puzzle. Later that evening, after Sarah was resting, I went down to the basement. Stored in a corner, beneath a dust sheet, was an old, unassuming footlocker. It didn't contain weapons. Those had been turned in or were securely stored elsewhere, far from this peaceful life I'd sought. This locker held remnants of my other self, old journals filled with observations and tactical notes, encrypted communication devices I'd used for some private security consulting gigs after my first few years out of the teams, detail maps of places I'd rather forget, and tools for information gathering that were perfectly legal but highly effective. It also contained mementos of my fallen brothers, reminders of what we fought for, what we protected. I opened it, the scent of canvas and old metal filling the air. It felt like stepping back into a familiar skin. My first step was observation, reconnaissance. For the next few days, I became a shadow. I learned Cromwell's routine. His early morning power walks, always the same route. The arrival of his preferred landscaping company, whose trucks looked suspiciously new and whose owner always had a fat envelope ready for Cromwell. The late-night meetings at his house with shadowy figures who didn't look like Oakhaven residents. I watched Riggs and Miller, noting their predictable patrol patterns, their favorite spots to loiter, their sloppy habits. They were creatures of routine, arrogant in their perceived impunity. I began to subtly engage with other residents, testing the waters. A casual chat with Mr. Abernathy while he was washing his car. A sympathetic ear for Mrs. Gable, whose prize-winning roses had been declared non-compliant. I didn't reveal my intentions, just listened, gathered snippets of information, felt the undercurrent of resentment and fear that Cromwell had cultivated. Many were angry, but felt powerless. They'd seen what happened to those who complained too loudly. Fines would escalate, liens would appear, life would become a constant battle of attrition. I also delved into the Oakhaven HOA bylaws, a dense, convoluted document that Cromwell had clearly twisted and amended to his advantage over the years. I cross-referenced them with state HOA regulations. My legal knowledge was limited, but my ability to dissect complex systems and find exploitable loopholes was well honed. Cromwell had overstepped multiple times. His procedural abuses were rampant. One evening, Sarah found me poring over printouts of financial statements I'd managed to obtain through a public records request for the HOA, a surprisingly transparent process if you knew where to look. She put a hand on my shoulder. "What are you planning, Mac?" I looked up at her, saw the worry in her eyes, but also trust. "I'm planning to restore some peace and quiet to this neighborhood, Sarah, the right way. Cromwell's built himself a little kingdom here, preying on people. It's time to dismantle it." Her lips curved into a small smile. "I knew you wouldn't let it go," she paused. "Just be careful. Always, I promised." But this wasn't a kinetic operation. This was about precision, about using Cromwell's own arrogance and his web of corruption against him. The SEALs had taught me many ways to fight. Not all of them involved explosives or direct action. Sometimes the most effective weapon was information, wielded with strategic patience. My quiet inquiries led me to 3 people who seemed like they might be willing to do more than just grumble. The first was Eleanor Henderson, a widow in her late 70s. Cromwell had been systematically fining her for the state of her lawn, despite the fact she paid a professional service that Cromwell himself had initially recommended before he had a falling out with them. Mrs. Henderson, however, was a former bookkeeper. She was meticulous, and she had kept every notice, every payment, every communication. She was sitting on a gold mine of documented harassment. The second was David Chun, a young lawyer who had moved into Oakhaven about 6 months ago. He was sharp, idealistic, and had already had a few run-ins with Cromwell over some particularly absurd architectural modification rules Cromwell had invented on the spot. David had the legal mind we needed. The third was a surprise, a man named Arthur Jenkins, who had served on the HOA board with Cromwell years ago, but had been unceremoniously pushed out when he started questioning Cromwell's handling of contracts. Jenkins was bitter, but also knowledgeable about Cromwell's early manipulations and how he consolidated power. He was initially hesitant, afraid of retribution, but the assault on Sarah, a new low even for Cromwell's thugs, seemed to tip him over. I approached each of them carefully, individually at first. With Mrs. Henderson, I simply offered to look over her paperwork, feigning an interest in understanding HOA finances. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. "You're not just interested, Mr. Macmillan, are you?" she'd said, a knowing glint in her gaze. "You think Arthur Cromwell is a crook? Well, you're right, and I can prove at least some of it." She then laid out a file so perfectly organized it would have made a logistics officer weep with joy. With David Chun, I was more direct. I met him for coffee, ostensibly to discuss the confusing HOA bylaws. I laid out what I suspected about Cromwell's abuse of power and financial impropriety. David listened intently, his expression growing more serious. "If what you suspect is true, and you can get evidence," he said, "Cromwell isn't just a bad HOA president, he's committing fraud, potentially extortion." Jenkins was the hardest. He was scared. Cromwell had made an example of him. I met him at a park outside Oakhaven. I didn't push. I just told him about Sarah, about the pattern I was seeing. I spoke about community, about not letting bullies win. I left him my number. 2 days later, he called. Cromwell has a slush fund, he said, his voice low. He uses the emergency repair budget. Always overinflated quotes from his cousin's contracting company. I could never prove it back then, but I know where to look for the patterns. We began to meet, the four of us, sometimes at my house, sometimes at Mrs. Henderson's, always discreetly. We were an unlikely team. The retired SEAL, the elderly bookkeeper, the young lawyer, and the ousted board member. Our little resistance cell, as Sarah jokingly called it. Mrs. Henderson's records, when cross-referenced with Jenkins's information about favored contractors and David Chin's legal analysis of the HOA's own financial disclosures, painted a damning picture. Cromwell wasn't just a petty tyrant. He was systematically fleecing the community. He was funneling HOA funds into his own pockets through kickbacks and bogus contracts. The fines he levied weren't just about control. They were about generating revenue for his schemes. And, in some cases, it looked like he was trying to pressure vulnerable residents into selling their homes cheap so he or his associates could snap them up. My role was often to connect the dots, to see the patterns that weren't immediately obvious. Years of intelligence analysis, albeit on a different scale, had honed those skills. I also used my surveillance experience, discreetly, of course. I documented meetings Cromwell had with specific contractors, noted deliveries of expensive materials to his own home that were mysteriously billed to the HOA's community improvement budget. I even managed to get photographs of Riggs and Miller meeting with a known local property speculator who had a reputation for aggressive tactics. The pieces were falling into place. Cromwell, meanwhile, remained blissfully ignorant of the storm gathering around him. Or perhaps not entirely ignorant. He must have heard whispers, noticed my quiet chats with other residents. One afternoon, Riggs and Miller appeared at my door. They didn't look as confident as before. They handed me a violation notice for the unapproved color of the welcome mat Sarah had recently bought. It was a standard beige. Mr. Cromwell asked us to deliver this personally, Riggs said, trying to sound menacing. He also said to tell you, it's best if you just keep to yourself, new guy. Wouldn't want any more accidents like what happened to your wife's garden. Or worse. I looked at the notice, then at them. I allowed a small, cold smile to touch my lips. Is that a threat, Mr. Riggs? He blustered. Just friendly advice. From Mr. Cromwell. Tell Mr. Cromwell I appreciate his concern for my mat, I said, my voice dangerously soft. And tell him I'm a stickler for rules myself. Especially the ones about making threats and assault. You might want to remind him of that. I held their gaze for a long moment, letting them see just a fraction of the steel I usually kept hidden. They shifted uncomfortably. They were attack dogs, but they weren't stupid enough to bite a hand that might just bite back harder. They mumbled something and retreated, clearly unnerved. Cromwell's arrogance, however, was his Achilles heel. He genuinely believed he was untouchable in his little fiefdom. This belief would be his undoing. His attempt at intimidation only strengthened my resolve and that of my allies. It also provided another piece of evidence for David Chun, who meticulously documented the veiled threat. Our strategy began to solidify. We had three main prongs. First, evidence. Mrs. Henderson's ledgers, Jenkins's insider knowledge corroborated by current financial discrepancies, my photographic evidence of suspicious dealings, and David's legal groundwork. Second, mobilization. We needed to get this information to the other residents and galvanize them to act. A recall petition, a vote of no confidence at the next HOA meeting. Third, exposure. A public confrontation where Cromwell couldn't hide or manipulate the narrative. David Chun drafted the legal basis for a recall and a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office regarding financial misconduct. Mrs. Henderson, with surprising digital savvy, helped compile our evidence into clear, concise summaries. Jenkins helped us identify other residents who had been targeted by Cromwell and might be willing to speak out once they knew they weren't alone. My role was coordination, security, ensuring our meetings weren't observed, our communication secure, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. I also quietly coached David and Mrs. Henderson on how to present their information calmly and authoritatively, how to handle Cromwell's likely outbursts. The stakes rose. Cromwell, perhaps sensing a shift in the neighborhood's mood or simply growing bolder, announced a substantial special assessment. It was for a community enhancement project, vague, overpriced, and involving his cousin's construction company. This was the final straw for many residents who had been on the fence. The grumbling grew louder. Simultaneously, Cromwell tried to expedite the lien process on Mrs. Henderson's home, a clear act of retaliation for her perceived defiance, though he didn't yet know the extent of her involvement with us. Then came the minor acts of vandalism. A few slashed tires on cars belonging to residents who had started asking questions at informal gatherings. A dead squirrel left on my porch, a crude attempt at intimidation. Sarah was frightened, understandably. "Mac, maybe this is too much," she whispered one night. I held her close. "Cromwell's getting desperate, Sarah. That means we're making progress. He's making mistakes. I installed a couple of discreet, motion-activated security cameras around our property. Nothing overtly aggressive, just enough to gather more evidence and deter further escalation. My old skills were, regrettably, proving useful even in Oak Haven. The desire for peace remained, but the necessity of action was undeniable. This is what happens when good people do nothing, I thought. Bullies fill the vacuum. The upcoming annual HOA meeting was our chosen battlefield. Cromwell intended to use it to railroad through his special assessment. We intended to use it to bring him down. The days leading up to it were tense. We worked late into the night, finalizing our information packets, meticulously organized dossiers containing summaries of Cromwell's financial misdeeds, copies of falsified invoices, photographic evidence, and sworn affidavits from several residents, including Jenkins. David Chun prepared a motion for a vote of no confidence and had the recall petition ready with an initial set of signatures we discreetly gathered. The night of the meeting arrived. The community hall was packed, more residents than I'd ever seen at one of these things. There was a palpable tension in the air. Cromwell sat at the head table, flanked by Riggs and Miller who stood against the wall behind him, attempting to look imposing. He beamed, oozing false bonhomie, clearly expecting to steamroll any opposition to his special assessment. As per our plan, just before Cromwell called the meeting to order, several of our discreet supporters began distributing our information packets to every resident. A low murmur rippled through the room as people began to open them, their eyes widening at the contents. Cromwell, initially oblivious, frowned as he noticed the rustling papers and hushed, angry whispers. He banged his gavel. "Order! Order! We have important matters to discuss tonight, starting with the Community Enhancement Project." He launched into his pre-prepared speech, full of platitudes and vague promises. But his audience wasn't really listening to him anymore. They were absorbed in the damning evidence in their hands. When he finally paused, expecting applause, or at least acquiescence, there was a heavy silence. Then, as prearranged, I stood up. "Mr. Cromwell, before we discuss any new projects, I believe there are some urgent existing matters the community needs to address." Cromwell's eyes narrowed. "Mr. McMillan, this is not on the agenda." "With all due respect, sir," I said, my voice calm, but carrying easily through the hall, "I believe the financial integrity of this HOA and the conduct of its president are very much on the agenda. Many of us have serious concerns, detailed in the information packets you now have." I gestured to the papers in people's hands. Cromwell's face began to flush. "Those papers are slanderous lies. An attempt to disrupt this community. Are they, Mr. Cromwell?" Mrs. Henderson's voice, surprisingly strong, cut through his bluster. She stood up, holding her own copy of the packet. "Because my bank statements and the HOA's own records show a clear pattern of misappropriated funds, fraudulent charges, and kickbacks. For years, you've been using our money as your personal piggy bank," she then detailed, with painful precision, several specific instances, citing dates and amounts. The crowd listened, rapt. Next, David Chun rose. "Mr. Cromwell, based on the evidence compiled, you are facing serious allegations of fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. We have already prepared a formal complaint to be filed with the state authorities. Furthermore, he held up a document. I have here a petition signed by a significant percentage of homeowners calling for your immediate resignation and a vote of no confidence in your leadership. Cromwell was on his feet now, his face purple with rage. This is an outrage, a conspiracy. Riggs, Miller, remove these disruptive elements. Get them out of here. He pointed a shaking finger at me, then at David and Mrs. Henderson. Riggs and Miller, looking uncertain for a moment, glanced at each other, then began to advance towards us. The crowd gasped. People shrank back. This was the moment I had anticipated, the one I had prepared for. I didn't move aggressively. I simply shifted my stance, a subtle adjustment that brought me into perfect balance, ready to react. My eyes locked onto Riggs, the more volatile of the two. Miller was a follower. Neutralize the lead dog, and the other often hesitates. I wouldn't do that if I were you, I said, my voice still quiet, but now edged with something cold and hard, a tone I hadn't used since I'd taken off the uniform. It was the voice that had given commands under fire, the voice that promised swift and decisive consequences. Riggs, fueled by adrenaline and Cromwell's desperate order, either didn't hear the warning in my tone or chose to ignore it. He lunged, reaching for my arm. Predictable, I thought. I sidestepped his clumsy grab, my hand shooting out to intercept his wrist. Using his own momentum against him, I spun him, applying a simple but excruciatingly painful joint lock. His eyes widened in shock and agony as he found himself bent forward, his arm twisted behind his back, his face pressed towards the floor. With a controlled push, I sent him sprawling, disarmed and neutralized in less than 3 seconds. He landed with a grunt, clutching his shoulder. Miller, who had been a step behind, froze mid-stride. He stared at Riggs on the floor, then at me. His eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. He saw not just a resident, but someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He took a hesitant step back. The hall was utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Cromwell stared, his jaw slack, his face now pale. The carefully constructed facade of his authority had just been shattered by a single, decisive action. His enforcers were useless. The crowd, moments before intimidated, now looked at me with a mixture of awe and dawning empowerment. They saw that Cromwell wasn't invincible. His power was a house of cards, and it was collapsing. The silence was broken by someone in the back, starting to clap. Then another, and another, until the hall was filled with applause. The spell of fear Cromwell had woven over Oakhaven was broken. People started shouting their own grievances, their own stories of Cromwell's petty tyranny and financial abuses. The evidence in their hands, coupled with the public humiliation of his enforcers, was irrefutable. David Chun seized the moment. I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in Arthur Cromwell as president of the Oakhaven HOA. Hands shot up all over the room. It was overwhelming, nearly unanimous. Cromwell sank back into his chair, defeated, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. His reign was over. As if on cue, though David had, with remarkable foresight, discreetly alerted them to a potential large-scale disturbance and allegations of significant financial impropriety, 2 police officers walked into the hall. They surveyed the scene, Riggs still groaning on the floor, Miller looking like he wanted to disappear into the wallpaper, Cromwell slumped in his chair, and a room full of agitated but now strangely united residents. David Chun calmly approached the officers, presenting them with a concise summary of the financial evidence against Cromwell and a copy of Sarah's earlier assault report against Riggs. "Officers," he said, "we believe Mr. Cromwell has committed serious financial crimes against this community. And this man," he gestured to Riggs, "assaulted a resident earlier this week, an incident that was reported." The officers listened, their expressions serious as they scanned the documents. One of them walked over to Cromwell. "Mr. Cromwell, we need you to come with us to answer some questions." Cromwell spluttered, protesting his innocence, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, a smear campaign. But his words were hollow. His power was gone. He was escorted out of the hall, a deflated, pathetic figure. The officers also took Riggs into custody, partly for the previous assault complaint, now bolstered by his aggressive actions at the meeting. Miller, seeing his cohort detained, wisely made himself scarce, slipping out a side door. A cheer went up as Cromwell was led away. It wasn't a cheer of malice, but of profound relief. The oppressive weight that had hung over Oakhaven for years had finally lifted. Sarah, who had been watching from the side, came over to me, her eyes shining with pride and relief. She squeezed my hand tightly. "You did it, Mac." I just nodded, a small smile finally gracing my lips. "No, Sarah. We did it." I looked around at the residents, now talking animatedly, a sense of hope and camaraderie filling the room. Mrs. Henderson was already discussing next steps with a group of homeowners, her face alight with purpose. David Chun was fielding questions, calmly explaining the legal processes that would follow. My initial goal, to stop the injustice against Sarah, had been achieved. But something larger had happened too. A community had found its voice. In the days and weeks that followed, Oakhaven began to transform. An interim HOA board was quickly elected, with David Chun stepping up as acting president and Mrs. Henderson naturally taking charge of the treasury. Their first act was to freeze all of Cromwell's questionable contracts and initiate a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances. The mess he'd left behind was substantial, but with transparency and community involvement, they began to untangle it. Unjust fines were rescinded, ludicrous rules were struck from the books, and the bylaws were painstakingly rewritten to ensure fairness and prevent future abuses of power. I acted as an informal advisor to the new board when asked, offering insights on process and security, but I had no desire for an official position. My work there was done. The peace I had sought when we first moved to Oakhaven began to feel real, attainable. Sarah's garden, no longer under threat of absurd regulations, flourished spectacularly that summer. She spent hours there, the fear replaced by a quiet joy that warmed my heart more than any commendation ever had. The neighborhood itself seemed to breathe easier. Block parties were organized. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves started talking, sharing, rebuilding the bonds that Cromwell's reign had strained. The legal consequences for Cromwell were severe. The audit uncovered years of systematic fraud and embezzlement. He faced multiple felony charges. His assets, including his overly manicured house in Oakhaven, were eventually seized as part of a settlement to repay the funds he had stolen from the community. His downfall was total and very public. Riggs faced assault charges and, given his prior record which David's inquiries helped uncover, served a short jail sentence. Miller simply vanished from the area. For me, the entire ordeal was a stark reminder that the skills I'd honed in theaters of war could find application even in the most unexpected of places. It wasn't about violence. The brief, controlled takedown of Riggs was merely a punctuation mark to a much larger strategic campaign. It was about observation, planning, patience, and the unwavering conviction that bullies, whether on a global stage or in a suburban enclave, should not be allowed to prevail. It had also, unexpectedly, given me a renewed sense of purpose. Protecting Sarah was paramount, of course, but helping restore justice to an entire community, empowering others to stand up for themselves, that resonated deeply. It felt like a fitting way to honor the memory of my fallen teammate by fostering peace and security in my own small corner of the world. And so, Oakhaven became a true community again, a place where neighbors looked out for each other, not over their shoulders in fear of the next arbitrary rule or trumped-up fine. It just goes to show you should never, ever underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who seem content to blend into the background. Sometimes, they're the ones with the deepest resolve. Standing up for what's right, even when it's just in your own backyard, can make all the difference in the world. My wife got her beautiful garden back, free from tyranny, and I found a new, more profound kind of peace than I'd initially hoped for. It turns out, sometimes the skills you think you've left far behind in your past find a way to become incredibly useful again, not for waging war, but for protecting the things and the people that truly matter. Thanks for listening to my story today, folks. It's a bit longer than my usual, but some stories need their space to be told right. If you enjoyed this, and I hope you did, please do me a favor and hit that like button down below. It really helps the channel. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing for more stories of justice, resilience, and maybe the occasional reminder that common decency should always win out. Don't forget to share this with someone you think would appreciate a good story of the little guys, or in this case, the quiet guy, winning. Thinking back on it all, what's the biggest lesson you took away from Cromwell's downfall and Oakhaven's renewal? I'd be interested to read your thoughts in the comments section. Until next time, take care and look out for one another.